Today I'm going to talk about a particular economist that I think has been a bit disregarded lately when we think about the contributions that he made, and actually it's someone who is very, very useful if we want to understand the role of entrepreneurs in the economy. The name of that economist is Frank Knight, lived in the US in the early part of the 20th century. And I want to stress a bit his contribution to entrepreneurship theory. And this is something that others have also discussed. The new thing here today is that I want to link it to systemic effects in a way that it's normally not done. I also have to talk about two other very important economists in entrepreneurship theory. It's almost obligatory. Those economists were first Joseph Schumpeter and then Israel Kirzner. Usually, when you're in an Austrian gathering and people talk about entrepreneurship, the default position is to stress the role of Kirzner, right? In some other contexts, if you're in a more evolutionary economic setting, let's say, then Schumpeter will be the key figure, okay? And I'm not trying to say here that those are bad theories. They're not. They're very interesting. But I will make the argument that Knight has something to offer that you don't really get in either Schumpeter or Kirzner. Okay. So, of course, this lecture is named after Friedrich von Wieser, and therefore I thought I should say something first about him. Now, let's see how this works. Where do I press this one? So where do I press? The arrows. Okay. Get closer to the mic so that people Okay, so this is a picture of Friedrich von Wieser. As a matter of fact, I did not know that he was so strongly associated with Prague until I got invited here. I thought that he always lived in Vienna, but that wasn't the case. So it's actually more like a Prague economist than an Austrian. Well, he's an Austrian economist, but not so closely associated with the country of Austria. Now, as Joseph Sima said earlier, when I think of the name Friedrich von Wieser, I'm mainly associated with opportunity cost, right? So opportunity cost is something we teach in all introductory courses in economics, and even though we normally don't mention his name, right? But he was the one who originated this important concept. He's also well known for the theory of imputation, how you can impute prices in production processes and so on. It's also one of the lasting contributions from the standpoint of economic theory. He did, however, also have some things to say about entrepreneurship. And I tried to find a quotation, and I found this one. In 1914, Wieser wrote that entrepreneurs are bold technical innovators, organizers, with a keen knowledge of human nature, far-sighted bankers, reckless speculators, etc. So not a very stringent definition, but somehow you can feel that there is an influence on Schumpeter later on here. It sort of resonates with his more well-known theory. However, one interesting thing is that Wieser already before Schumpeter, he said that entrepreneurial profit is a specific payment made to entrepreneurs for entrepreneurship, after all contractual payments have been made, right? So here we can see actually a clear linkage with all of the three most famous entrepreneurship theorists, because entrepreneurial profit is actually defined in a similar way by Schumpeter, by Kirzner, and by Frank Knight. Right? So here are the key thinkers. When we think about entrepreneurship theory, the guy in the middle here is Frank Knight, right? And on the left-hand side, we have Schumpeter. On the right-hand side, we have Israel Kirzner. And the reason I position them in this way is that Schumpeter's theory of economic development was originally published in 1911 in German, and then it was translated later on, and the English version is from the 1930s. But he sort of predated Knight. Knight's key contribution here is his very famous book, Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, which was published in 1921. And then much later we have Kirzner's key contribution, Competition and Entrepreneurship, from 1973, right? Now, you probably don't know the guy on the right here in this picture. But we'll be trying to look at some linkages here. The person on the right is Roger Koppel. Roger Koppel is an Austrian economist. He's a professor at Syracuse University in the US. And my argument here today is that you can link some of Knight's ideas with some ideas developed much later by Roger Koppel. Why do I want to do that? It's because if you look at Frank Knight's contribution, you don't have a very strong linkage to system-wide effects, okay? You have that in Schumpeter, you have that in Kirzner, you don't really have it in Knight. But by taking some new ideas developed by Koppel, you can actually get this linkage, and they fit together very well, in my opinion. Okay. So, when we think about the systemic effects, what are they? Well, for Schumpeter, he starts his whole discussion with something called the circular flow, right? And the entrepreneur is a very unusual figure, and they disrupt the circular flow. So you start with a kind of equilibrium. And a lot of people like to point out that Schumpeterian entrepreneurs are disequilibrating versus Kirznerian entrepreneurs who equilibrate markets. So it seems like they're sort of like the opposite. But that is not necessarily the case, because Schumpeter and Kirzner, they define equilibria in different ways. So the circular flow is sort of Walrasian, the one that Schumpeter uses. And that means that it's not the same kind of perfect equilibrium that was developed in the 1950s and 1960s. Rather, there is no assumption that everybody knows everything, that everyone has perfect knowledge and perfect information and so forth. That doesn't really exist in the original equilibrium model. So in a way, Schumpeter's notion of equilibrium is more realistic than what came later. Now what Kirzner does, he wrote against the background of a dominant model of equilibrium in neoclassical economics that was mostly developed in the 1950s and 1960s by people like Gerard Debreu and so forth, where everything is perfectly balanced and you have an intertemporal equilibrium that means that you only have to open the market once and then everything is solved if you make these assumptions. And what Kirzner tried to do then is to contrast the role of the entrepreneur against this sort of unusually perfect equilibrium, right? But we still have a linkage, and he was saying that we make some knowledge discoveries on the path to this equilibrium, which would occur, according to Kirzner, if there are no exogenous changes to the economy. So we're sort of approaching this kind of economic nirvana, if you like, right? Now, there isn't really a linkage like this in Knight. If you read Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, you'll find that the first two parts of the books are very similar to a standard economics textbook. It's only in the third part where you get the new theory of entrepreneurship, which stresses Knightian uncertainty, which is sometimes called structural uncertainty nowadays. And he says it's the entrepreneur that shoulders this, but it's not really clear how you can link this to either equilibrium or disequilibrium. Okay. But I'm going to show that by incorporating a bit of some ideas that were developed by Roger Koppel, you can actually get a very good linkage, so you don't have to accept this sort of weakness as compared with Schumpeter and Kirchner, right? Schumpeter and Kirchner are nice because it's more like a complete theory, right? But by integrating some ideas that were actually developed within the Austrian tradition later on, it's actually possible to have a theory that is just as systemic as the other two famous theories. Now, there are some other reasons why I think that Knight offers a very fruitful theory for further research. One is that it's actually easier to use Knightian notions as a basis for empirical research, and that's what, when we talk about entrepreneurship studies, let's say, there's a lot of empirical research going on, but the linkage with Kirchner, for example, is very tenuous. Some people try to say that they're doing a Kirchnerian analysis when they do empirical studies, but mostly it's because they don't really understand the Kirchnerian theory, in my view. Okay, so if you have a Kirchnerian theory, then an entrepreneur is not really a person, right? It's a function. It's an economic function, and everybody has different functions. So sometimes they're entrepreneurs, sometimes they're capitalists, sometimes they're just a labor input, and so on, right? And the same is true of the Schumpeterian theory. Now, what makes Knight very different here is that uncertainty is central to the entrepreneurial function, which means that the entrepreneur actually owns resources. That's not true of either Knight or of either Kirchner or Schumpeter. So we have a resource-owning entrepreneur in Knight. And to put this in an Austrian context, two other economists have argued forcefully for the usefulness of Knight as an entrepreneurship theorist are Peter Klein and Nikolai Voss. And they have pointed out that there is a strong similarity between Knight's notion of the entrepreneur and Mises's notion of the entrepreneur, of ownership, right? Okay. So the idea that I will explicitly incorporate here is something called the system constraint. Now, I first encountered this in a book and a journal paper by Roger Koppel. So there is a book from 2002 called Economic Theory, it's called Big Players and the Economic Theory of Expectations. And in that book, he introduces this concept quite carefully. There is also an article in the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization from 2004, and it's called Rational Choice Hermeneutics, which sounds sort of like an oxymoron, right? But that's what it's called. And again, he is making this argument that system constraints are very important if you want to understand whether an economy is equilibrating or not, if it's moving in the direction of an equilibrium or not, right? Okay. Another very useful feature of Knight's theory, which was also pointed out by Voss and Klein, is the close connection to property rights theory, right? About the control of attributes of resources, economic property rights, especially as it has been expressed by Joram Barcel, for example. However, that is more like a more neoclassical equilibrium type theory, so the dynamics are not really entered by Barcel, but it still offers quite a good fit with the Knightian theory if we make property rights theory a bit more dynamic. Okay, so I'll just give you a brief background here about Schumpeter and Kirchner, because these are sort of like the benchmarks. Whenever you're talking about someone who's not Schumpeter or Kirchner in entrepreneurship theory, you have to say something about the two most famous theories, right? So Schumpeter, he makes a division between the entrepreneurial and the capitalist function. So this does not necessarily mean that an entrepreneur is one person and a capitalist is another person. It just means that a person can be both, or neither, or just one. Right? It's a type of economic action. And there is no real clear discussion, as in Knight, about uncertainty and risk and so forth, but it's basically the capitalist who shoulders some sort of not very well-defined risk in the Schumpeterian theory. Whereas the entrepreneur, what does the entrepreneur do? The entrepreneur combines factors of production in new ways, right? And in Schumpeter's view, like Böhm-Bawerk before him, he refers to the original factors of production. So we don't have capital or capital goods then. We only have labor and land, the two original factors of production. Because capital is basically a combination of labor and land. It's a mixture. And if we start at the beginning, then we only have labor and land. Later on, we'll have capital goods that are combined through various stages of production. Okay. Now, another interesting feature of Schumpeterian entrepreneurship theory, and it is a feature that is absolutely necessary if we want to start with a circular flow and then have entrepreneurial action as the agent of a disequilibrating change, and that is that entrepreneurship has to be confined to a very small minority of the population. It's an unusual type of person who can exercise this type of innovative entrepreneurship, if you like. So the point that Schumpeter is trying to make is that there's a lot of social resistance, a lot of institutional resistance against doing something new. Most people are very, very risk averse from this point of view, and they just want to do what everyone else is doing period after period, and the economy just keeps repeating itself. But there is a small group of heroes, entrepreneurial heroes, like captains of industry, who can break this mold. And when you read Schumpeter, you get the sort of a feeling that it was very much influenced by Nietzsche, for example, about this sort of superior person who is ultimately responsible for economic development, the hero entrepreneur. Right? The majority are locked in a Walrasian circular flow. Okay, so it's an aspect of individual behavior. Now Kirchner, this other one, is a bit different, but also in some ways similar to Schumpeter. So again, we have a division between the entrepreneurial and the capitalist function. It's an aspect of action when you're an entrepreneur. So there we see a similarity between the two scholars, right? And the way that Kirchner puts it is that there are things, profit opportunities out there that haven't really been noticed by others, but they're available for everyone, so it's like a free lunch. But you have to open your eyes in a way, and he calls it entrepreneurial alertness. So people are alert to differences. In the simplest case, it's like arbitrage. You buy low and you sell high. In more complicated cases, it's like innovation. So you buy inputs that are too cheap compared with the value of the entrepreneurial output, right? But it's something that is simply discovered by persons in their entrepreneurial role. But unlike Schumpeter, Kirchner does not claim that this type of action is concentrated in a small minority of the population. Rather, you get the impression that it's quite a common thing to occur among people or economic agents in general, right? And then, when he thinks about the theoretical systemic implications of his theory, he does not use an old-fashioned circular flow equilibrium, but he looks at the very perfect mathematical equilibrium models that were developed in the 50s and 60s, where everything is perfectly adjusted, where you have sort of a perfectly competitive economy in its most efficient state, and where all information and knowledge has already been discovered in the past. So he's saying entrepreneurs are the ones who are responsible for discovering this path to the ideal state. And if it were possible, of course it isn't in practice, but if it were possible, Kirzner claims, to have no exogenous changes in terms of technology, in terms of resource availabilities, in terms of consumer preferences, then entrepreneurial actions will gradually discover everything that is economically valuable until at the end we reach some sort of very, very perfect state. Okay. So that is the Kirznerian story. As you can see, both Schumpeter and Kirzner have take great care to really explain what the systemic implications are of their respective theories. Right. Again, entrepreneurship is an aspect of individual behavior. Okay. Also, there are some unstated assumptions here. Now, when, for example, Kirzner says that it's just alertness, it's something that happens at a moment's notice, it's costless because it doesn't really take time, it's just an insight or a discovery that all of a sudden somebody sees that costs and revenues are not the same, there is a gap that enables the entrepreneur to earn profits. Okay, but you take something for granted here, which is that you have some basic capitalist institutions. You have well-defined property rights. You have free entry, right? So you have sort of ideal conditions. You also have to assume that the entrepreneur actually understands what revenues are and what costs are. Now that could be, we could argue that actually understanding what revenues are and what costs are and so on, what opportunity costs are, that's, to me, sounds like you need some sort of human capital here, actually. Yeah. And some institutional capital, right? Okay, so that's the background. Kirzner and Schumpeter. Now, Knight's path-breaking contribution was in the third part of his most famous book. And it's when he makes the distinction between risk and uncertainty. Now, if you look at most mainstream economists, what they do when they talk about uncertainty is that they actually talk about Knightian risk, right? You have a well-behaved probability distribution. You have a set of outcomes that can be specified in advance, A, B, C, D, or E. So even if you don't really know what's going to happen, you can just assign equal probabilities to each of these known outcomes. This is risk, according to Knight. Now, uncertainty is very different. Uncertainty is a state where you cannot assign probabilities to what's going to happen in the future. And why is that? Because it's an open-ended list. So if you don't know if there are 10 different outcomes or 100 different outcomes, it doesn't really make sense to even assign equal probabilities, right? In one case it will be 10%, in the other case it's 1%, right? If you don't have enough information, right? And that is because it's so open-ended, there are so many things that could actually happen in the future. And it depends on things that haven't been decided yet. If you come up with a new innovation, maybe it's very successful, and maybe it's difficult to imitate, and you're going to earn big profits over a long period of time. But it might equally be the case that somebody comes up with an imperfect substitute that most consumers consider superior. And what happens then is that maybe those profits are very small of the original innovator. This is something we cannot know because even the people coming up with the innovations in the future, they don't really know what it is that they are going to come up with or discover or imagine as a background for economic action later on. Okay. But unfortunately, this was a big breakthrough in the 1920s, but for a very long time, other economists forgot about it. They didn't really pay much attention to what Knight wrote, because they wanted very well-behaved models. And well-behaved models are associated with what is nowadays called parametric uncertainty, or risk, which means that you have a probability distribution, you have a known set of outcomes, and that makes the world much easier to model in mathematical terms, right? With mathematical functions and with unique solutions and so forth, right? And Knightian uncertainty is more complicated because you can't really reduce it to this. So, what does this imply for individual behavior? Remember from your economics classes, introductory, microeconomics, for example, what do we assume there normally? We assume individuals who maximize utility, right? And if you have a firm, that firm maximizes profits, which is an indirect way of maximizing utility. Now, later on, we had the psychological insights entered economics, especially through Herbert Simon in the 1950s. And he said, no, it's impossible. From the point of view of psychological research, people don't have enough information. They don't have enough knowledge processing ability to maximize anything. So the only thing they can do is satisfies. Not finding the best solution, but finding a solution that's good enough, given their limited information and given their limited information processing capacity. But it's still sort of like a similar framework. It's just that people are less perfect. Now, what Knight speaks about is something that is totally different when he speaks about people actually confronting truly uncertain situations. And he says they don't maximize or well, he didn't say that because they didn't have that vocabulary when he wrote his book. But he would have said that they don't maximize and they don't satisfy, they judge. So what you do when you do something entrepreneurial is you judge a course of action to be promising or not. Probably according to some sort of scenarios, right? You can't have a probability distribution, but you can imagine a best case scenario, a worst case scenario, a sort of baseline scenario, right? That's possible, right? But you don't maximize, you don't satisfy. So if you have uncertain outcomes, you exercise judgment about how to act when facing an uncertain and unknowable future. Well, it's unknowable until it actually happens, right? Now so this is in general when we have uncertainty. Entrepreneurship becomes entrepreneurship when the person exercising judgment owns resources. So it's about judgment about how to deploy resources that are under your control, under your ownership. That is the Knightian definition of entrepreneurship. Okay, now for those of you who are familiar with property rights theory, you might see a linkage here. And that one is absolutely correct if you see that linkage. Because we can think about property not just as a resource, but actually as a bundle of valuable attributes, right? And this bundle of valuable attributes can actually change over time, even when the resources stay the same. And you can choose, for example, if you have human capital, we all have some sort of human capital. And our human capital is not just one thing, it's a bundle of attributes. It can be, knowledge of economic theory, knowledge of calculus, knowledge of 3 languages, or whatever. All these are attributes of human capital. And you can deploy or benefit from these attributes in 2 different ways. One is by renting them out. Then you get a contractual compensation, right? A contractual compensation, according to Knight and according to most others, well, those are not entrepreneurial profits, right? Those are called wages or salaries or that. You get something because you supply human capital to someone who decides how to deploy that human capital. But if you decide instead to deploy it according to your own judgment, Well, then maybe you rent some resources to help you. Maybe you have some workers you want to hire to help you with your plans. So there we have contractual compensation. Maybe you have to be in a house somewhere or on a plot of land, so you need to rent some land, and maybe you need some equipment that you might have to rent that too, right? But whatever remains after those contractual compensations have been paid is a residual. And that residual is defined then as the profit or the loss, right? And that's the linkage to entrepreneurship. So here we can see a similarity with other theories, right? We have this linkage. But the difference is that it's firmly grounded in the idea of ownership of various types of capital, whether human capital, physical capital, right? And you become a residual claimant then. Okay, this is also a very, very often articulated idea in property rights theory, right? Residual claims are very important. After all, contractual compensations have been paid. And this is then what constitutes the return to entrepreneurship. Okay. Notice also that if you have a contractual compensation, it's much easier to calculate costs, and it's much easier to know how much you're going to earn in the future, right? If it's reasonably stable and there is no war and so forth, you know what you're going to get. If you have a labor contract, for example, or a contract to rent out a building and so on. But there is no such contractual guarantee when it comes to the residual claims. Okay. So the resource owner here who seeks control over the resource seeks, in effect, entrepreneurial profit. That is the goal, but it's not a maximizing goal. It's not a satisfying goal. It's a goal based on judgment, right? And the normal way to do this is very closely coupled, actually, to the idea of innovation. It's about creating new capital attributes from owned resources, right? So the resource might be fixed, but the valuable capital attributes are not fixed. You can add to them. And if we look at economic development over time, we can see that the economy is always tending to get more complex, right, over time. Capital is becoming more complex in a growing economy. And those are the effects of lots of entrepreneurs exercising their judgment to add new attributes to the capital they own, to the resources they own, right? So we say here that capital is now it's understood in the Knightian sense, because Knight also wrote about capital, right? And he had a very exhaustive view of capital, which is basically that virtually everything is capital in a way, right? So we have human capital instead of labor. We have physical capital, which is what most people think of when they use the word capital. Money is also kind of capital. But we also have even social capital, right? You can capitalize on your knowledge of different people, your connections in networks, in various interpersonal networks. That makes you more valuable in a way, the people you know. So I'm going to give you an example to simplify it a little bit here. So we have Adam here. It's an example I actually used in a paper I wrote about this. And we just assume that one of the skills of Adam is to be an economics lecturer for undergraduate students. So we can imagine that's the person on the left. I tried to find some illustrations here, and I didn't find the same person. But just imagine it's the same person. So, okay, the one on the left is the same as the one on the right, but the one on the left has less hair, a beard, more glasses, right? But the idea is that this is one of his human capital attributes on the left, being able to give an undergraduate lecture in economics. Let's just assume that. On the right, on the other hand, he is an inspirational speaker. Okay. So, what am I trying to say here? You might wonder. Okay, so Adam has economic property rights over an open-ended bundle of resources. It's a resource which is an open-ended bundle of human capital attributes, right? And let's say that we have two very important attributes here. One is the sort of contractually compensated one. It is a recognized ability to teach undergraduate microeconomics. And let's say that the maximum market value for this, it's just a hypothetical number. Let's say it's $50,000 per year. That's the highest paying school is willing to pay him $50,000 to be a microeconomics lecturer. Right? So he could actually then maybe maximize or at least satisfies his contractual compensation. He can work wherever they pay him most. Right? So this is recognized by the market. He has a recognized human capital attribute consisting of an ability to teach microeconomics. But let's also assume that Adam is convinced that he can give very inspirational speeches. And this is not recognized by the market, but it's not recognized by any employer. But he thinks that he can really tell people why creativity is important for business success. And he thinks he can sell tickets to big events and that people will be captivated and they will be prepared to pay big money to listen to him. Okay. Now this would then, it has no market value to begin with. Nobody else recognizes this. But if he decides to do so, it would be an example of Knightian entrepreneurial judgment. He decides that if he keeps control, ownership over his labor services, so he can keep all the money he gets, then here he becomes an entrepreneur. And he thinks, of course, he has to believe that this is promising. It doesn't mean that it has to be promising, right? If you ask a number of entrepreneurs whether they think that the venture they just launched is going to be successful, they're all going to say yes. But after the event, you're going to discover that some of them were not so successful, right? But what I also want to illustrate here is that the payoffs are structurally uncertain in the Knightian sense. It's very difficult to know whether this is a good idea or not. Just think about some of the things that might happen here. Okay. So if he decides to embark in this, what does it imply? Well, first of all, it means that Adam actually thinks that he knows better about what to do than what the market does at the original point in time, right? He thinks that colleges, firms, bureaucracies, all potential employers, they underestimate his true value, his potential true value. And when he adds this motivational speech skill to his pre-existing human capital bundle, he actually innovates a new human capital attribute in a market context. Remember, innovation means that it doesn't mean invention, it means entering the market for the first time. That's the most common interpretation of the word innovation. But it is, and this is something I want you to note, it is a priori impossible to estimate his expected profit in objective terms here. This is a new type of inspirational speech experience. And I'll give you some scenarios. Consider some possible outcomes here. Maybe he becomes a celebrity, and it gives rise to very high willingness to pay among all the ones who want to come and listen to him. And there are no close existing or potential substitutes according to the people who are paying this money. So one can say in this case, this would be an ideal scenario from Adam's point of view because it would be like a winners take all situation. He would get big profits because he becomes like a unique brand. So this human capital attribute becomes extremely valuable, very profitable, right? Now, is this the only thing that can happen? No, it's not. Second one, let's say Brian, another person. He outcompetes Adam by offering what almost all potential consumers think is a superior imperfect substitute, right? So now somebody else enters the market and offers something that is much more inspirational in the views of those who pay, or the consumers of this product, right? And in this case, Adam might just get a tiny payoff before the other person enters the market. Now, are these the only two outcomes? No, they're not. We can also have, you get numerous similar but not identical imitators who sort of notice that Adam makes big profits giving these speeches, and then over time, the input prices are bid up, the output prices are bid down, etc., until the market price goes down. Maybe these imperfect substitutes, they offer a cheaper experience, and this will then siphon off some of the original customers because they think actually Adam is not so special. You get these other speakers, they're much cheaper, and actually it's almost the same. Now we might have a moderate transitory payoff. Or something totally different might happen. Consider alternative 4 here. Adam's speech is noticed by political operatives, leading to a successful election campaign. And Adam makes use of his speech skills there. Maybe he doesn't earn as much money in this way, but maybe he really enjoys exercising power. So this actually makes him, make much greater utility gains in a way, right? So this is also something that could happen, right? So what we can see here, the reason I'm giving you these examples, there are many more, is that I want to show you that there is simply no way that we can model this or formulate this as a certain number of outcomes with a certain probability before all these things happen, which depend on the decisions of many other people. Many decisions might never have been made had they not noticed Adam's early success, maybe. So the people who are making these decisions in the future don't even realize that this is on the horizon for them later on. So what are the implications here? Now, if we think about this open-ended list of potential outcomes, they're obviously not compatible with standard equilibrium models, which is why you never encounter this kind of discussion in an introductory economics textbook, right? Because they're very focused on well-behaved equilibrium. Right? Remember that in equilibrium, all factors are in the same marginal return, right? So that's when all the interesting stuff is of the past, happened in the past. One can also say that it could be a movement away from an equilibrium or toward an equilibrium. It depends on how we define equilibrium. So this links it with the Kirchner-Schumpeter discussion here. Do we think in terms of an absolute equilibrium or just some sort of stability? And in a way, this sort of unites the three entrepreneurship theories here, right? There are similarities. If we remember that Kirchner and Schumpeter, they discuss different equilibrium. So what are the differences among these theories? What are the key differences that really matter here? Well, the good thing about the Knightian theory, so that's an argument I'm making in this article, is that Knightian theory actually treats Adam more like one person, right? He's either an entrepreneurial or a maximizing owner of human capital attributes. But in his entrepreneurial role, he exercises judgment, he deploys his resources, he shoulders uncertainty, resulting in residual claim. So this means that entrepreneurship is not just a momentary thing, not just an alert discovery or an insightful combination of a decision about an insightful combination of resources, right? It's like almost in the Schumpeterian and Kirchnerian views, the entrepreneurial aspect actually takes very little time, and most of the time people are not entrepreneurs. Here they can remain entrepreneurs as long as they control economic property rights over their resources. So if we think about Schumpeterian and Kirchnerian approaches, Adam has different hats, right? He combines resources in new ways, that's Schumpeter. Alert to unnoticed profit opportunities, that's Kirchner. And that's the entrepreneurial aspect. But then somehow he lends money to himself, then he's all of a sudden a capitalist. And then he might hire himself as a worker, that's his role as labor, right? So the entrepreneurial aspect sort of evaporates as soon as it has been exercised. It is responsible for the profits that people make, but they sort of avoid the problem of risk or uncertainty and so on. That's something that other people have to deal with, especially capitalists, right? According to this classification scheme. Now, for empirical research, that means that a Knightian theory, in my view, is preferable. Why? Because whatever happens in empirical entrepreneurship research is very often deals with situations that would count as entrepreneurship in the Knightian theory, but would not count as entrepreneurship in the other theories. Right? So firm creation is entrepreneurship, right? Innovation is entrepreneurship. New allocations of resources within firms are also entrepreneurship. So any sort of observations about residual claimants would be relevant from an empirical perspective here. But this is not true if we look at Schumpeter and Kirchner. And Kirchner himself has said that he doesn't think that most of the attempts that entrepreneurship scholars have been made to do empirical studies based on his theory make any sense. Because he says it's not easy to do empirical research on his theory. Because what can we do in empirical research? We can maybe ask people, do interviews, ask people how they noticed the profit opportunity all of a sudden, right? And then went back to their normal roles as labor or as capital owner or something. But you can't really study a process over time. It's a momentary thing. And the same is actually true of Schumpeter. How did they actually come up with the realization that it's a good idea to combine inputs in new ways? So the role of empirical research here would be much narrower than is actually the case in less theory-based entrepreneurship studies. Now, the weakness is, of course, the lack of a discussion of the systemic effects in the Knightian theory about equilibrium, disequilibrium, and so forth. And, of course, here expectations become very important, and also whether they are convergent or divergent. And this is where I want to bring in Koppel's attempts at formulating an economic theory of expectations. But first I want to say something about Hayek. So Hayek, he said that, okay, we have in a society, we'll have some shared habits, we'll have some shared norms, some shared traditions, some shared rules. Basically what we might call institutions. And these will give rise to expectations that are not too divergent, okay? There will be expectations that arise within a shared institutional framework. And the way Hayek described it was that you have a combination of slow biological and fast cultural evolutionary processes. And these create institutions. Institutions create stable and convergent expectations among people who interact in markets, right? So this is the argument that we have a well-behaved market economy based on these institutions. And then he also introduced the idea of spontaneous orders. And what are spontaneous orders? Well, the spontaneous order of the market is a sort of selection process. And what do these selection processes do? Well, they sustain fit expectations and weed out unfit expectations or institutions, and that's also expectations. So we have some sort of idea in Hayek's mind here that expectations are sort of over time will be convergent if we have, well, good market institutions. Now, is this always true? Well, Koppel claims it's not always true, but it's sometimes true. Okay, it could be true. And he is, in his book, Big Players and the Economic Theory of Expectations, he's trying to solve a problem which in Austrian circles has become known as the Lockman Problem. Right? Lockman was the one who did not really believe in convergent expectations. He thought that, well, the economy is always in disequilibrium, basically. And he says it really matters what kind of a situation we're in. First of all, what type of competition do we have? Is it atomistic or is it dominated by a few players? In other words, atomistic here was sort of referred to not only perfect competition but also monopolistic competition, right? Lots of actors. Doesn't have to be the textbook model, but as long you need to have a lot of people competing against each other. The other thing that really matters is institutions. Are the institutions that regulate the market, are they stable? That's one very important feature. There has to be stability over time. Also, they have to be non-discretionary. Okay, so individual people cannot go in there and just change the rules just because they feel like it. And the opposite would then be unstable institutions and what Koppel calls big player discretion. So a big player is an individual actor who has a lot of power and is not really constrained by anyone, who can alter outcomes, who can decide what is profitable and what is not. And he then links this to expectations in a really ingenious way. He says, if we have a situation where we have atomistic competition and stable, non-discriminatory market institutions, then expectations don't really matter that much because market competition is going to weed out bad expectations. So we're getting close here to the Chicago School sort of rational expectations framework, right? Where, you have an evolutionary process that gets rid of everything that's not fit until only the best expectations survive, in a way. Right? But this is not always the case in markets. Sometimes we have rules that change a lot, that are unstable, and that are subject to discretion, where there are powerful players who can alter outcomes, who can decide who is profitable and who is not. And then we can't rely on any sort of convergence. Instead, and that's the other paper I referred to earlier, is called Rational Choice Hermeneutics. So he said, rational choice models are okay, but only if we have this atomistic competition and the stable rules. If we don't, if either of those two elements are lacking, then we have to be more like, we have to do some sort of hermeneutic analysis. We have to interpret what the key players think, what motivates them, what they want, their theories of the world. Okay, so then it becomes really important to know what these people want and what they do and how they're trying to do it. We need to actually think about the real expectations of real people, and they are cognitive, right? And he says, if we have the first situation, we'll have a system constraint that is very tight. And the most extreme one would resemble the models that we learn about perfect competition, right? That would be at one limit. You can only choose in one way. But the further away we get from this problem, from this situation, the looser the system constraint becomes. Okay? And if we have a really loose system constraint, there is a lot of things that you can do, and which will not force you to exit the market if you're, let's say, an entrepreneur, or if you're an economic actor. So what he says here is that from this perspective, entrepreneurship is sort of disequilibrating, because it's an attempt to break loose from a very competitive situation and create a transitory monopoly in a way. But if entry costs are low, then imitators can go into markets where profitability is visible. Input prices are then bid up, output prices are bid down, And the system constraint is gradually tightened, and then we might reach some sort of new equilibrium here. So it's sort of similar in a way to the Schumpeterian story in that case. Right? But if entry costs are prohibitive, then the system constraint might stay somewhat loose. I call this the Jack Nicholson effect. Why? Because Jack Nicholson has, in my view, a very unique face, right? So other actors are not going to look like Jack Nicholson. He can have a high market value because it's very difficult to act like Jack Nicholson, look like Jack Nicholson, right? So that's good for him. It's like the dream scenario for Adam earlier, right? So then you have somewhat loose system constraint, and therefore the cognitive expectations matter, because remember, if you have a stable monopoly, you don't have to aim actually or get to the profit maximizing point. You just have to be somewhere between the break-even point and the profit maximizing point, which means that there's a lot of slack in the system. Okay. But of course within limits. It's not so extreme because you can't set any prices you want. Okay, just for you who are too young to remember, well, he's still alive, right? Yeah, I think he is. But this is the one that made him famous, this scene here, right? From The Shining, horror movie, late 1970s, I think, around 1980, when he was younger. So he has this very special face. Okay, so if you have a loose system constraint, that means you have slack, and then divergent cognitive expectations become possible. It becomes much more like a Lockman world, if you like, right? Now, the loosest system constraint, what would that be? It would be non-atomistic competition. For example, some sort of state capitalist scenario where you have one firm with a protected monopoly, but that still wants to be profitable. And you have big players who shape institutions at their discretion. Okay? So you have politicians that just decide that this is not a good idea, I want to do it done this way. And there are no real constraints, right? They can do whatever they want because they are the rulers. So rule by decree plus a soft budget constraint. Then you have the real indeterminacy, according to this framework, with Knightian entrepreneurship plus Coplian system constraints. Yeah. And then the best we can do then to understand what's going to happen in the future will be to study the beliefs, the motivations, the expectations of these individual big players, these powerful figures who can shape the world any way they like, or almost any way they like. So we get an indeterminate systemic outcome. We don't really know what's going to happen. I'm going to give you an illustration of this before we end, or what it can look like when we have this sort of a situation. Now, I lived in China for 5 years, so I'm going to take a Chinese example, which is this. Okay. This is a city called Ordos in Inner Mongolia, and some discretionary local government officials decided that it was a very good idea to just construct a new town for 1 million people in the middle of the desert. Okay? And last time I checked, this town had 20,000 people in it, right? Not 1 million. So it's quite empty and considerably less beautiful than Prague. Right? Okay. So that's what happens then, right? You have this sort of a lack of the rule of law. On the one hand, you have very powerful big players, and you have, well, local monopolies in a way. Protected monopolies. So, a more positive note. So if we have low barriers to entry, if we have stable, transparent, and non-discriminatory institutions, then we get generally tight system constraints. But we also at the same time get incentives for entrepreneurial loosening, because entrepreneurs want to earn profit. They want to break away from this by creating some sort of monopoly-like situation where they can get profits, right? But if entry costs stay low, probably these profits are not going to be there forever. So we have then a repeated disequilibrating innovation, followed by equilibrating imitation and tightening of the system constraints. So that's the point we get to if we combine Knightian entrepreneurship theory and Coplian system constraints. And what we can say then, how do we link all this to economic development? I think the best way to think about economic development is as a process of complexification. Things get more complex over time. This is a process, by the way, that lasts for centuries, right? So over time we get a more complex economy. And this, how do we get this more complex economy? It's by entrepreneurs and their creation of new capital attributes, whether physical capital attributes, human capital attributes, social capital attributes, doesn't matter. It's capital attributes that are added to resources. It's discovered in a way, but actually it's imagined and judged potentially profitable through the exercise of entrepreneurial judgment in the face of a structurally uncertain future. Okay, so that's how they do it.
Thank you, David. We have time for 1, 2, perhaps 3 questions or comments. So now the floor is open. All right.
Thank you for excellent presentation. I would like to ask you about the differences between Knightian theory of entrepreneurship and Misesian. Do you agree that this is the same or not?
Well, I think it's maybe a bit more developed, but I mean, I could just follow here what Nikolai Voss and Peter Klein claim. I actually talked to Peter Klein about this and asked him the same question, and he thinks it's essentially the same theory, but the Knightian theory is a bit more developed. Yeah.
Thank you. We have one question at the back.
Yes, hello. Well, thank you very much. And my question is that with regards to Knight, I mean, I haven't studied his work very, very closely, but I know that when it comes, for example, to the mainstream, let's say, Samuelsian models of equilibrium, he was not really a big fan. And the whole crux of his work is, it depends on this uncertainty bearing production or function, let's say, in the economy. So how does that fit in his models? How is a phenomenon, or let's say a factor that would be considered highly psychological or let's say highly subjectivist, how does it fit in his theory? I mean, does he has a theory of uncertainty, exactly how it works, and how is it modeled among other factors of productions like land, capital, and so on? How does all of this fit in his entrepreneurial theory?
Okay, could you repeat the question again? Maybe it was not really clear.
Yeah. Okay, so Knight focuses on uncertainty, right?
Yeah.
So uncertainty is a main factor in entrepreneurial activity.
Yeah.
Now, uncertainty is, let's say, something that we cannot just take it objectively like that and say that we have uncertainty and therefore build a model. So I'm just asking, how subjectivist does Knight goes with his treatment to uncertainty in his theory?
Okay, so you're saying here that subjectivity, well, basically judgment is, I don't think that Knight uses the word subjective at all, but when they judge something to be potentially profitable, or they believe it to be profitable, that is a highly subjective judgment, right? Even though he doesn't use the word, right? And then how it plays itself out in the future has to do that we introduce a system constraint here, which sort of means that it's not because people are not subjective, but rather because of the process of competition, certain firms and certain ideas are not profitable and they are forced to exit the market, right? If the expectations do not conform to what it is that people value in general, and like the general average expectations in the population. That's how I would interpret it, anyway. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. We have Dr. Triska, a great admirer of Frank Knight.
Yes. My question is, Is it a part of an international trend or global trend to admire all of a sudden Knightian approach to whatever, basically?
I don't know if it's an international trend. I mean, I think the one who really started it was a professor at the University of Connecticut by the name of Richard Langlois, right? And he came up, first sort of popularized Knightian ideas from a slightly Austrian perspective, right? And then the big impact was by Nikolai Voss and Peter Klein, and they published a paper, I think in 2007, called the Entrepreneurial Creation of Heterogeneous Capital, or something like that, right? And then I read that paper. I thought their argument was quite convincing. So basically, they were very successful in terms of persuading me, and so most of it you can already find in Voss and Klein. Later they wrote a book together, just I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. But the thing you won't find there is this linkage to system constraint. So that is the new contribution in this paper. I don't know, however, if this is a growing trend, because now I mentioned 3 people apart from myself. So.
Okay, and I guess one last question.
Okay, thank you for an excellent presentation. My question is about the previous question. How do you fit the Bayesian learning and updating to these judgments in the world of Knightian uncertainty?
Bayesian updating?
Yes.
So that is basically getting probabilities that evolve over time, right? So,
but you can apply that to belief structure. Basically, what you're doing is the probability structure is converted into a belief structure, which Knight calls as judgments.
Well, this is sort of related, I think, to the whole thing about subjective probabilities too, right? So I talked here about objective probabilities, but of course...
subjective probability is the belief.
Yeah, but I mean subjective probabilities that are updated on the basis of new information. That would be something like Bayesian probabilities. Now, I think the real difficulty... That is not a difficulty if you have a list of possible outcomes. The problem here, the key difference, I think, is that the list of possible outcome cannot be completed, and you have no idea about how many different outcomes are possible. So that is the main difficulty for a Bayesian approach here is not having probabilities is in itself not a problem, but not having a complete list of outcomes is a problem. That's how I interpret it.
Thank you very much for your talk, and thank you for questions and your answers.